Hello everyone, my name's Kylie and I'm going to be presenting whaling in the Antarctic, Australia v. Japan, with New Zealand intervening. So this was a larger scale international case which had a bit of media spotlight while it was occurring. So just to give a little background information to help things make sense, because there was a lot of components to this case, one of the big points here is JARPA, which stands for the Japanese Whale Research Program, and they act under a special permit in the Antarctic. So the objectives of JARPA is to estimate biological parameters to improve stock management of minke whales in the southern hemisphere. It's intended to explain the role of whales in the marine system of the Antarctic. Their objective is to explain the effect of environmental change on cetaceans and to explain the stock structure of minke whales to improve stock management. So there is a second phase of this, and this is really what the case focuses on, which is called JARPA 2. And so it started as 2 feasibility surveys between 2005 and 2008 with the intent to monitor the ecosystem of the Antarctic, so things like whale abundance, krill abundance, and the feeding ecology. It also is to show competition between whale species, explain spatial changes in stock structure, and to improve management for minke whale stocks. So another important term is special permit whaling, and this is what JARPA and JARPA 2 operate under. So special permit whaling is also known as scientific whaling. So permits are basically granted to kill, take, and treat whales in the name of scientific research. So the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling establishes what's called the International Whaling Commission, and these are all just key players involving whaling. And this entire case is based off of Article 8, which is an international article that states that countries are permitted to kill the whales for scientific reasons and research purposes only. And Article 8 also gives responsibility for setting and regulating this to the individual governments and countries, not the IWC, which is how Japan got into trouble with everything because they were responsible for handing out these permits. Pictured on this slide is actually a research boat from Japan, and you can see that they're capturing whales in the name of research. So some facts and overviews of the case. So in 2010, Australia instituted proceedings against Japan due to their pursuit of large-scale whaling in the name of JARPA 2. Australia with New Zealand requested that the ICJ, so the International Court of Justice, deem Japan in violation of its obligations of international agreements of special permits regarding whaling in the Southern Ocean. Australia is claiming that Japan has breached its obligations with the ICRW. Australia also claims that Japan is not preserving marine life and the environment as previously obligated, and instead has been negligent with whaling protocols. So Australia was actually joined by New Zealand to proceed against Japan for their misconduct within International Article 8. On September 19th of 2012, New Zealand's government requested copies of the pleadings between Australia and Japan and for some documents on the case. The court did grant this request to New Zealand and did provide those documents to them as requested. And on November 20th, 2012, New Zealand filed in the registry of the court a declaration of intervention in this case and expressed the right to intervene as a non-party. So basically they wanted to be involved with this case. Both Australia and Japan were notified of this, and the court deemed that a hearing was unnecessary to review New Zealand's proposed intervention. And on February 6th, it was decided by the court that New Zealand's declaration of intervention was admissible, so they permitted New Zealand to be a part of this case. So the claims from Australia regarding this case is that Japan is in breach of its obligations internationally by implementing the JARPA 2 program in the Southern Ocean. So Australia was requesting that Japan cease the implementation of JARPA 2 that they revoke any authorizations, permits, or licenses allowing the activities which are subject of this application to be undertaken. And it also wants to provide assurances and guarantee that it will not take any further action under JARPA 2 or any other similar programs within Japan until such program has been brought into conformity with its obligations under international law. So basically, Australia is saying that Japan is not following through with abiding by Article 8, and JARPA 2 is not in compliance with Article 8. So some of Australia's observations and how it has violated its obligations internationally is by not following a zero catch limit in relation to the killing of whales for commercial purposes. They don't feel that Japan has refrained from undertaking commercial whaling of fin whales in the Southern Ocean Sanctuary. They also feel that Japan has not observed the moratorium of taking, killing, or treating whales except minke whales by factory ships or whale catchers attached to the factory ships. So Australia reports that JARPA 2 is not a program for scientific research within the means of Article 8. So again, they want Japan to refrain from authorizing or implementing any special permit whaling, which is not for scientific research within the means of Article 8. It wants Japan to cease with immediate effect the implementation of JARPA 2 and revoke any authorizations, permits, or licenses that allows the implementation of JARPA 2. So basically, they want Japan to cancel the permit for JARPA 2 because they feel that they are whaling not for the correct reasons for scientific research, as described in Article 8. So some of New Zealand's observations are that Article 8 should always be interpreted in good faith and take into account the rules of international law. They understand that special permits are exclusive to the purpose of scientific research, and they feel that it should remain that way. So they do acknowledge that permits are objectively issued, but they do think that it should be taken into consideration the program's methodology, the design, the characteristics, the structure, how it was conducted in general, and the results as well. And they feel that special permits should always limit the number of whales killed under that permit, so the level is lowest necessary for the objectives of that research. So some of Japan's observations is that the court declares that the claims brought against Japan by Australia lack jurisdiction. Japan does wish that the application of New Zealand for permission to intervene lapses, so they did not want New Zealand involved anymore. And they also feel that New Zealand has made many conclusions on points that are relevant to the case, and they misstate the scope of Article 8. And Japan does feel that they are within the bounds of Article 8. So just to also clarify some definitions of scientific research, since it is such a large part of this case. So there were multiple scientists and biologists involved in this entire case. Per Australia, there's 4 things that define a scientific research regarding whaling. So there should always be defined and achievable objectives like questions or hypotheses that generate knowledge important to conserving and managing whale stocks, that there's appropriate methods such as lethal methods only where objectives of the research can't be achieved by any other means, peer review, and then avoiding having any adverse effects on whale stocks. So per Japan, the essential characteristics provided by Australia are not incorrect, but they're all perceived as recommendations in their opinion. So Australia and Japan can agree what scientific research means, but could not agree on the specificity from characteristic to characteristic. This is important because Article 8 is based on the killing of whales based on scientific research, so it's good that both countries agreed on this, but they just had different viewpoints of the specifications of it. So some more discussions of scientific research. So lethal methods is a very important part of this case. So Australia feels that per Article 8, lethal methods for scientific research are only valid when non-lethal methods of analysis and existing data are insufficient. So Japan actually disagrees with this, since they feel that Article 8 still permits the killing of whales and it goes back and forth on the lethal methods. And Japan defends itself, saying that they don't use lethal methods more than they consider necessary. New Zealand also asserts that the permits must be granted in a precautionary manner, and whales should really only be killed when absolutely necessary. So both Australia and New Zealand reference the IWC resolutions to support their stance. So, taking into account other definitions of scientific research, the court does deem that they're not particularly significant in the case, and Australia is unable to maintain that there have been adverse effects on relevant stocks. So, therefore, those four criteria established by Australia are not persuasive enough for the court to define scientific research, but they also don't think that it was mandatory to define it to move forward. So, some commercial whaling arguments. So, Japan argued that there's a lot of differences between commercial whaling and scientific whaling. So, the main argument provided by Japan is that commercial whaling really just involves the largest of the animals and only the species of high commercial value. So, the supplementary argument is that in scientific whaling, the species that are of less or no commercial value can still be targeted for research, what they feel that they did. So, Australia acknowledges that Article 8, Paragraph 2 allows for the selling of meat of the whales as the byproduct of whaling for scientific research, which is another key point here. So, Japan argues that the sale of meat to fund research is allowed. New Zealand also agrees that the sale of whale meat is appropriate, but it is not a requirement. So the court views that the sale of whale meat and the using of the finances to fund research is insufficient to cause a permit to not be within Article 8, and it would need to be examined a little bit further to deem it as not being scientific research if they're using the meat of the animals for it. So Australia does also mention that employment and maintaining a whaling infrastructure would be indicative of whales being killed not just for scientific research. So moving forward to the initiatives and Australian arguments. So one of JARPA's initiatives is to determine an estimate of the natural mortality rate of minke whales. For example, they're checking out and trying to look for the possibility that a whale will die from a natural cause. So Australia believes that this objective is really irrelevant, and they are mostly just finding a reason to kill whales. So Japan was technically able to provide an estimate of natural mortality rates based on the data they obtained, but really the parties disagree that there was even a scientific contribution for conserving and managing whales. So Australia maintains that Japan is basically committed to lethal measures and that JARPA is premised on killing whales in general. The court really didn't make a statement on this. So some issues. So even though there's many non-lethal alternatives to research, special permits don't fall outside of Article 8. However, JARPA 2 has not analyzed non-lethal methods to reduce their lethal sampling. So sample size formulas are a determining factor to negate how many whales are used for scientific research. Japan wasn't able to provide adequate information to rationalize how their sample sizes were selected. Additionally, Japan could not explain why they used really small sample sizes for some species and then don't have a sound basis for really large amounts of some whale species. They have been conducting some research on other whales, but they've used almost all non-existent lethal methods, and then they specifically used lethal methods on the whales that are commercially in high demand. So Japan has been killing whales in the name of scientific research, but they can't provide adequate research or explanations supporting their stance of respecting Article 8. So the judgment, the court feels that Japan's whaling program has aspects that can be seen as scientific research, but the evidence shows that the program is not reasonable. And they feel that the special permits granted by Japan for treating whales, taking them, and killing them are not for purposes of scientific research, and therefore the result is to revoke the permits, authorizations, licenses, etc. So evidence shows that the JARPA 2 research plan is not transparent, and it lacks explanations for sample sizes and does not utilize non lethal techniques when there's plenty for them to choose from. The court does reflect on how Japan differentiates between commercial whaling and scientific research whaling, and the use of lethal methods was almost exclusively used on minke whales, and at one point in time, they did acknowledge scientific whaling as necessary to achieve a stable supply of minke whale meat. So the court came to their conclusion and felt that Japan breached three provisions regarding whaling. So they feel like they absolutely did not respect zero catch limits for killing for commercial purposes. And they feel that the factory ship moratorium was ignored and that the prohibition on commercial whaling was also ignored. So the court was able to see lapses on research objectives on their different lethal and non lethal approaches. And evidence does suggest that the whaling program could have been adjusted to smaller sample sizes, and they really couldn't explain why Japan did not do this. So, minimal effort was given to achieve the objective of using non lethal research methods and focus more on funding research from whale meat sales. The final disposition of the case does show that the court decided in the favor of Australia and New Zealand, and they were granted majority vote in all circumstances by the court. So overall, the court does deem that JARPA 2 has performed activities that can be perceived as scientific research, but does not relate to the stated objectives of the program. So the court deems that the permits granted by Japan for killing, taking, and treating whales in the name of JARPA 2 are not for purposes of scientific research. So overall, the court does expect that Japan will rationalize and understand this decision, but they do revoke any licenses, permits, or any authorizations under JARPA 2 pursuant of Article 8. And overall, my analysis is that I completely side that Australia and New Zealand were in the right, and I do feel like Japan was using JARPA to cover up commercial whaling, and they used the term scientific research to cover it. Really, the only point that Japan made in this entire 70-page case is that scientific policy really can't be appraised by a courtroom. But I feel like since there were so many biologists and experts sitting in on the case, that they were able to make a decision and an educated decision. I do think that it was pretty difficult for anyone to defend Japan in this case. I feel like Japan maybe didn't expect that all of this was going to catch up to them. And I feel like their explanations and rebuttals and defenses really reflect this. I feel like maybe had Japan had evidence that they were exercising more non-lethal methods with minke whales and that their scientific research was legitimate, it was possible that there would have been a different outcome, but unlikely. Here's just a picture of a whale and my references.